Good evening, everyone. Welcome to our first hybrid meeting. It's nice to see all of you in person finally. So this evening, first we have the study session. Those people at home are also able to participate. If you'd like to speak to the board this evening in person, you will put in a card and hand it over to Eliana. If you're at home, you can fill out the Google Doc and still participate. Translation is available both in the building and remotely. Si necesitas traducción, tenemos traducción. Puedes llamar al teléfono que se requiere 978-990-5137 y oprimes 83-77041 y el número, el signo de número. So, do we have any changes to the agenda this evening? None? Okay. With that, we all know to turn off our electronic devices. And let's see, Eliana, if you could put roll call, please.
Trustee McAvoy,
Present.
Trustee Wells,
Here.
Trustee Lawson,
Here.
Vice President Marquez.
Here.
President Diaz-Locum.
Here.
So moved.
Second.
Okay, that was Elisa and Janet. And now that we're all here, we can say all in favor, say aye.
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 Ellie, do we have any oral communication?
Not for the study session.
Okay, then let's get on to the study session this evening. It's the update on workforce housing at 750 Bradford Street.
So good evening, everyone, and welcome. We have a study session tonight, and this study session will entail the workforce housing project that has been in play for Ms. McAvoy for what, 2 years, 3 years now? Seems like we get to a point and then we need to continue to observe and integrate and see what's next. So this evening, our consultant, Peter Ingram, is going to give you an update with some further information regarding the funding for the workforce housing. So Peter, I believe you have total access now, and the screen is yours to utilize.
Okay, good evening. Can everybody see the slide on the screen? Is the slide visible?
Yes,
Yes.
we can see it.
Great, okay. Good evening, trustees and superintendent. I'm pleased to be back with you tonight. I have some slides that are going to move us through a review of kind of the history of your projects district-wide and where the new initiative for workforce housing has come from. And then I'm going to hand it off to Joy Coomer, who will talk to you about a proposed bond measure and what's entailed with decision-making for the Board of Trustees for that. And then we'll segue into your discussion and questions and direction. I would like to start just by recognizing that several of your senior staff members are also online. So I'm going to encourage them to interject as I go through history because they lived it day in and day out. And I'm a latecomer and an observer, but I think we've got a pretty good summary for you tonight to just walk us back in time and kind of go back and say, well, where's the district been with its facilities and what's ahead? So for those of you who were active in the district back in 2013 to 2015, you'll recall that there was a facilities master plan committee that convened and created a 10 to 15-year vision for the district-wide programs and facilities. At that time, there was nearly $400 million worth of facilities identified as either needed or highly desirable to support and sustain programs in the district. In May of 2015, the board adopted the facilities master plan. And at the time, they were very deliberate and very clear that this is the first of probably 3 phases of big project packages that would need bond financing from the public, from your voters. So if we now move to what happened in November of that year, your voters supported your bond measure, Measure T, with 62.5% of the vote. You'll recall that 55% is required for passage when you do these on a general election year. So your bond fund was created as a result of that. You established a Citizens Oversight Committee, and you were authorized to issue up to $193 million of general obligation bonds. And of that, 141 million was available for that first phase, or about 1/3 of your project list. And if we look back at what Measure T has accomplished, it's actually accomplished a lot. And you as a district should feel proud of how you've executed the package of projects. They were complex, spread all over your district facilities. But you've managed to renovate aging classrooms, science labs for 21st century learning. You've created more flexibility. You've updated libraries, computers, and technology at all of your schools. You've repaired and taken care of deteriorating roofs and other aging infrastructure, either safety or fire code or earthquake safety. You've replaced old, outdated, and inefficient electrical, plumbing, heating, and ventilation systems, the latter being especially important, as we've all begun to appreciate as this pandemic continues. And you've provided dedicated classrooms for music, art, and performing arts electives. So right now, as we understand it, you're reaching significant milestones with Measure T program, and your first phase is nearing completion. So the second phase is looming on the short-term horizon and is going to require funding. So in that latter couple years of your district-wide projects, there was a new initiative that showed up that has to do with workforce housing. And this began back in 2018 when a group called Planning for Our Future was appointed and the work was launched by the district. In April of 2019, the board approved the members of what was called the 7-11 Committee. And that committee was charged with making recommendations for use of surplus property and space and real property across your district, including the district office property downtown. At that same moment in time, there was a lot more attention being given to the crises with teacher housing across the state of California, and indeed beyond California, but California seemed to be at the tip of that issue. And so if you look back into the period of the spring and summer of 2019, there was a lot of articles in the press about this emerging crises and what was driving it. The EdSource, which is a nonprofit education publication, did a series of special reports, and I've just got some screen snips here to show you the nature of what they were writing about and what they were finding in their studies and analysis. This really helped bring to the forefront for a lot of districts the realization that there's this crisis in the current time that is going to ripple forward and make it increasingly difficult to attract the best and brightest teachers and staff to districts. And as the analysis pointed out, a great percentage of districts and employees in districts really can't afford to live in the communities where they teach. Slightly earlier than that, 2016, the the governor signed into law the Teacher Housing Act, and that provided school districts with some new tools to address this crisis and to try to find solutions. And here's some of the statistical analysis that appeared at that time in the EdSource surveys and analysis. As you can see, if you go to their website and drop in Redwood City Elementary School District, this shows that a great percentage of your staff simply can't afford to live in Redwood City and be close to where they teach and be in the community where they teach. And this map was especially shocking to me because the entire jurisdiction of Redwood City is in the red, which is unaffordable according to the criteria that they use to compile the analysis. So it became more and more clear, and your board at the time really sort of heard that and understood it to be a challenge and began to think about what to do about it. So in June 19, your board voted to move forward with a feasibility study that would look at the district headquarters property as a potential site for affordable housing for teachers and staff. That vote took place in the context of the work of the 7-Eleven committee, who had come with recommendations to the board. I think it's important to recall and keep in mind what the board's decisions were at that time. They made a conscious decision that leasing out the district office in the context of surplus property was probably not the highest and best use of that property for the district's long-term interests. And they also decided to conduct a feasibility study for the possibility of workforce housing. At the time, it was articulated that the priority really had to do with reducing cost of living impediments to recruiting and retaining the best and brightest teachers and staff, to be competitive with other area districts that have gone down this road or are planning to, and to create an affordable housing option for employees in the extremely high cost peninsula market and right here in our community. You probably know that several districts in the county have actually moved forward with workforce housing, and you may hear some more on that from Joy in a few moments. So now we get to the late winter, early spring of 2020, and the developer that owns the property next to the district office, the Sobrato organization, began a conversation with your board about a joint project that would leverage efficiencies for parking and shared infrastructure to create the housing project for the district and office for the developer. At the time, the developer, with board support, identified that getting into the Redwood City gatekeeper process for downtown projects was really important. They had opened up a window of opportunity for developments to submit preliminary applications and to essentially get in the queue to be considered for entitlements after the city updates its downtown plan. So your board recognized that the best window of opportunity really was at that moment and going forward because of the urgency to address the needs, the state laws that were in place that gave you extra tools, Redwood City itself, its commitment to affordable housing across the spectrum. So we're in a friendly city for affordable housing, and that's a big plus. And the downtown precise plan, which really is the great enabler of density and transit to create walkable, very high quality living opportunities. So I think in the course of that, the board again recognized that the district office property has a lot of value to the district for problem solving as it relates to housing and other needs. So this public-private partnership that is in its early stages, and you're still in a feasibility mode with that, has the potential to maximize efficiencies of scale, mitigate site problems, and deliver city approvals. So having a development partner that was actually envisioned in the 2016 Teacher Housing Act, districts are encouraged to work with private developers to create public-private partnerships. So this is very much in line with the vision of that law. In August 2020, the district and the developer entered into a memorandum of understanding that has a 2-year period to it that formalizes the understanding that feasibility needs to be conducted by both entities to arrive at a decision of should this go or not. And at that time, your board directed that you wanted to begin your own feasibility to really fully explore this. In October 2020, the City Council approved the gatekeeper request and directed their staff to process a formal application. And then in December 2020, the board launched an internal project alternatives analysis, which your board has been briefed on, to really make sure that we've looked at all the alternatives for use of the site and that indeed a partnership makes the most sense. So in June of last year, a formal application was submitted by the Sobrato organization and the district that includes 87 workforce housing units in a 7-story building, an office building next door, and 2 levels of shared parking. That application is now in review by the city. We expect to be talking to city staff about their initial comments and some of the issues that they've identified that need resolving probably within the next week or 2. So as a reminder, this is the configuration of the proposed project. Your district office currently is under the blue building, and the 1-story developers building is over here on the corner of Jefferson and Bradford. And the idea is to essentially flip so that the housing is on the corner and the office is on the parcel that currently is occupied by your office. And these are renderings from the architect team that went with the application. So there's a problem to be solved, and not surprising, it has to do with costs and financing. Building housing on the peninsula in our time is insanely expensive, and it's not getting any cheaper, unfortunately. We currently think that you're going to need a budget approaching $77 million to execute a project of this scale. And it's worth noting here that we've added money to that budget, that sort of projection, assuming that we might find a way to actually create more housing units on the site by the time the application is finalized and the city is considering it. Your board has been clear with the project team that we need to ensure that your general fund is protected from any new expenses before, during, and after construction of housing, should it go forward. We understand that. And so the whole idea is to make sure that your financing plan shows that the housing is essentially separated from your operational educational budget and funding. The board may be able to issue certificates of participation up to about 52 million that would be supported by rental income once your building is completed and occupied. We are still in a lot of analysis and refinement, so these numbers will move around, but we believe we're in the right range. And the upshot that is for discussion tonight is there is a funding gap that's probably in the range of $25 million, and you need a very durable, predictable source of funds to fill that gap. One of your options is to go to your voters in the context of a district-wide bond measure and add this to the list of projects that are coming towards you. So I've moved pretty quickly. I'm going to just pause there to see if any committee members, staff have anything to add to background and history before we hand this off to Joy to walk through the next part of the presentation.
Peter, the only thing I might add, I'm not sure if you mentioned this, that the district office at this point is not included in this price estimate. So the replacement of the district office is still under negotiations through our public-private partnership.
Yep.
Conversations with Sobrato, but ultimately just know that that's not included in the $77 million.
Yes, thank you.
Yeah, you bet. Great summary, Peter. Really appreciate all that you did to put this together.
It's a great story. I appreciate being able to tell it. Any other questions or comments on history or background? If not, I see Joy is with us, and I'm going to advance to the next slide and hand it over to her.
Thank you very much, Peter. Good evening, members of the board. It's a pleasure to be back with you tonight, Superintendent and other members of the committee and cabinet. Tonight, I'm here to talk about one way that you might be able to fund both additional projects that have been identified in the facilities master plan. Just a quick reminder that Measure T was only meant to cover a first phase of projects, so there are additional projects there. And also consider how you could fund some of the additional funding for the workforce housing. So one availability option to you is a GO bond measure. There really are only a few ways for districts to fund facility needs. You are using many of those already as part of different things that you're working on, including the public-private partnership. Obviously, the general obligation bond is the next one. There are actually some examples of San Mateo County districts that have included workforce housing with school repair GO bonds, with traditional bonds. Those include Pacifica School District up on the coast. We worked with them to help pass their last bond measure. And one of the projects listed specifically was their Osgood housing, which they've been working on just these last few years. They wanted to leave that as an option. I don't know if they've actually used the funding, but they were planning on using it and having that available. The other example is Jefferson High School District, who actually passed a GO bond simply focused on workforce housing. And that was primarily done by board members and teachers who put a lot of work into it. And they just got that 55%. So it wasn't an easy election for them, but they did actually pass and have been working on workforce housing. On the next slide, I'm going to go through a little bit more information about bonds, specifically, when they can go, what's the passage rate, and also look at some of your election opportunities that are available. So this has a lot more detail on it. And for many of you, you remember being involved in Measure T. So this is not new information. But, just to start off, many districts look at general obligation bonds simply because the state is no longer helping fund school facility needs. And so many school districts all across the state rely on general obligation bonds to help fund facility needs. That includes basic repairs, building schools, maintenance. All of those items are covered under those bonds. Bonding capacity, non-unified school districts, so elementary school districts, it's a maximum of 1.25% of assessed valuations. So that would be something we would work with your financial advisor on. You also are limited to $30 per 100 of your assessed valuation to decide what that ultimate dollar amount of the bond would be. They do require 55% voter approval, and they do have to be on a regularly scheduled election. Now that all council races and school district races have been moved to even numbered years, that does mean that you would be limited to a primary or a general election. So in 2022, that means that June would be available and November would be available. Considering how far we are already in 2022, June seems like it would not be an option, but November definitely would be an option for the district. Should you not be interested or able to go in November of 2022, you would have to wait until the primary or the general election of 2024. The other big requirements, obviously, you have to call for the election at least 88 days before. And on the next page, I have a little bit of a timeline that kind of goes through that. You have to declare your resolution with a project list. You have to state the tax rate and the bond amount. And then just like Measure T, you would have a Citizens Oversight Committee appointed. You can use the same oversight committee, and annual audits, again, the same as Measure T would be required. So that's no different than what you already do. So if you are considering or would entertain a November timeline, the first thing that you would want to do is really explore the feasibility. And that's going to tell us if you would be able to consider a November of 2022 election, or if it would be a better option to look forward to 2024. During this feasibility early stage, it would involve hiring our firm, and the district has worked for many years with Godby Research on putting together a voter survey, looking at the bond amount that would be available under different tax rates for the district, considering anything else that might be on the ballot in November. We do know that there is a gubernatorial reelection. Gavin Newsom will be up for reelection again, just after a recall election where he was very successful. So those are all things to consider. We can do that voter survey here early and be able to provide information back to you that would give you time to consider whether or not to move forward with a November election. You'll remember that after you get the voter survey information, there is sort of a period of go or no go, where the board makes a decision. Should we continue to explore whether we should move forward, or should we just wait? If you decide to move forward, that's what puts you into those sections of 2 and 3, building consensus. That really is community outreach and putting together your project list and doing consensus building in the community. Once the board calls for the election, which would have to be before August 12th, an independent advocacy campaign would pick up and start to do the advocacy that would be involved in a campaign in order to pass the bond measure so that it would get that 55%. And I think I have one more slightly detailed slide that really looks at the first steps. And so, as I mentioned, the first steps really would be focusing in on that feasibility study to test not only whether a geo bond is feasible, but you could ask other questions that are important to the district and that are related specifically to workforce housing. This more detailed timeline would involve the board, again, approving contracts to move forward with the survey. We would begin some internal communications regarding the needs so that people understand the purpose, and then conduct that survey all here in January and early February. And then in February, we would reserve, we may have to have another study session. We may be able to get on a regularly scheduled meeting to review those survey results with the board and then make that go or no go decision. So the feasibility only allows you the option of exploring if this is possible for November of 2020. It does not commit you to moving forward with November of 2022. And I just realized I went back in time, not forward. So we are talking about November of 2022. So many districts are at this very same juncture. They're spending January and February reviewing the feasibility so that they can decide whether or not to move forward for November. And so that is sort of the timeline and the mechanisms of a geo bond. I also welcome any questions if anyone has any.
Any questions? No?
Can I ask one, Maria?
Oh,
So Joy, this is John. And so the question for me is, so January, right now we're in January, today is the 12th.
Yes.
So you're saying between the 12th and the end of January, the the entity, which is Godby, would be doing the survey and seeing, how our community feels about going out for another bond. Is that sufficient enough time? I mean, 2 weeks?
Well, it will go into February. It's not going to happen overnight. You're right. There is a little bit of a process of putting together a few individuals because they have done the surveys for the district before, and because you do have a complete facilities master plan, we know what's been completed with Measure T. We'll be able to quickly pull together the projects, including the workforce housing projects, for this survey. So I don't anticipate that putting together the survey would take a lot of time, but we want to make sure that we're asking all the questions that the district is in. And then it does take about 7 to 10 days in the field. So if we take a week to put the survey together, then it's about 7 to 10 days. Then they typically require 4 days to get the analysis done. So it's 2 to 3 weeks. Obviously, if we need more time or we have to pause in a step, it could take a little bit longer. But I do think by the end of February, we could easily have results back and be able to provide those to the board to make a decision.
Yeah, thanks, Maria. Maybe just to give a little context from the Housing Committee, since Janet and I have been on the committee and really immersed in all these conversations, certainly more so than our other 3 colleagues. So I thought I'd just give a little more background information, sort of how we got here and why we're here now. And then that might help with any questions that you might have as well. So as you know, we've been working diligently with Peter Ingram, our consultant, who's been working with K&N on our financial analysis. We subcontracted with consultants who really gave a better detail around what it would cost to actually, better cost estimates, just really finalizing more of sort of the numbers we think we're at. So all of a sudden we got to the number of 77 million with a lot more information than we had a few months ago, realizing that the COPs or the loans that we can get are not going to cover it. So we began to realize, well, the other major option that we have is to go forward with this GO bond, which is why then Peter and the committee reached out to TBWB to try to get a handle on what are our options to go forward with the bond. We also, in turn, talked to Don Diaz, who is our bond director, and Don is on the call if you have any questions for him. And he also, both him and Priscilla have been coming to our committee meetings to help with the financial information, as well as just kind of construction information, that sort of thing. So what we began to realize is, we're wrapping up our current bond. We know we have another 2 phases there. We know that if we want to go forward with workforce housing, we're going to most likely need a bond to help cover that 25 million. And so if you look at it, although it feels very fast to go for November 2022, if we wait, we're looking at November 2024. And that actually makes it a lot more complicated for the workforce housing to continue moving forward, with the assurance that we would have, 1, do we have community support to do this? 2, to make sure that we'd have the finances we need so we would not have to dip into our general fund, because that's just a bottom line. We cannot dip into the general fund for the workforce housing. So just that's a little bit more like, how did we get here? Why now? And of course, with the holidays and everything like that, here we are. So I think what the committee would like tonight, and the reason, we had Peter kind of give the background of how we got here and where we're at on the workforce housing, Joy on what the bond would look like, is we need to give direction to Dr. Baker tonight. Would we like to go forward with the feasibility study, which is certainly the next step? That would give us a lot more information. Is our community supportive of this? Are they ready for us to go? Do they want us to do this? That'll help give some additional information on that. And then assuming that the board gave direction tonight to move forward, we would be moving forward quickly. The committee even talked about in the next week, we could help start getting some questions together, that sort of thing. The contract we would be approving at the next board meeting. TBWB and Godby would get to work right away. You can see the timeline we have. There's a lot to do in January and early February, and then it would come back to the board with the information, and so personally, and I think Janet felt the same way out of the committee. Our recommendation is we need to move forward with the feasibility study to get the information. I will say the other good news is on looking at both our bond needs for school facilities. We have a facilities master plan. Don Diaz thought that we could update that fairly quickly because it was a really good plan. So it's really just kind of updating with any new information, all the COVID stuff. Is there additional HVAC systems or things like that we need? We know we've tried to be doing more outdoor learning environments, gardens, those sorts of things, getting the kids outside. So there might be some tweaks to the facilities master plan, but that should be pretty easy. And then we could test some of those projects in this polling that we do. In addition to the workforce housing, is the community supportive and wanting to help us with this project, and also this bond. So in some ways it's rushed, but in some ways, it's sort of good timing. Let's do this together. Let's see if we have the support. And that's sort of where we're at. So yeah. So I don't know if that helps. Janet, I don't know if you want to add anything to what I said.
No, I don't think right now. I think you covered it all.
The only thing that we did discuss also with our attorney, and she is on the line with us tonight, Clarissa, was to make sure that, we could use the GEO bonds in that fashion, that it could be used in a manner of going not only for our own schools to do the improvements, but also go towards the workforce housing. And Clarissa said it is, yes, you can go in that direction.
And I also say that I had a conversation with, in addition to the 2 school districts that Joy mentioned that she knew of in our county, Jefferson Elementary School District also passed a GEO bond, and they're constructing their workforce housing right now. And they were saying that their community was supportive. They were encouraging us to think about that as an option. Because we're really thinking, it's a perfect use of a bond if you think about it, because you're thinking long-term, you're thinking 20, 30, 40, 60 years out, which is sort of what bonds are meant to do, right? It's meant to be for capital sort of expenditures.
Right.
Yeah.
Thanks a lot for adding that context in there. That was definitely really helpful. And one of the questions that I had was, is our second phase of the facilities master plan ready to go? And it sounds like what you're saying is that we think that, yeah, it would be ready to go there. So what I didn't also understand was, is there actually bonding capacity to cover this and the facilities master plan? I couldn't tell if that's part of the feasibility study or if we already know that.
I don't believe we know that, correct, Dawn?
Yeah, I will say that this came up in the committee, and I don't remember, it was Clarissa or Joy who talked a little bit about how that works, and that you can approve the bond, and then you look at your bonding capacity, and then you basically just will get the bonds as you have the bonding capacity, but somebody could talk about it more articulately than that.
Yeah, I believe that was Joy who was explaining the bonding capacity.
Okay.
Yeah, I mean, so many school districts do actually exceed the capacity, so that, that amount in the of assessed valuation from your community that it generates, that's what sort of determines what your limit is. So there are 2 different things that you think about when you think about bonds. One is how much, I'll just kind of use general terms. How much indebtedness can you have against your community who ultimately help you pay back the bond? And that's that ceiling that the state sets, that's 1.25%. The second is, how much is our bond? And that's the, like 170 million, or whatever that dollar amount is ultimately that you get for the bond. And that's based off of that $30 per 100 of assessed valuation. So many districts do actually exceed that threshold, that 1.25%. But what they do is they obtain a waiver from the state. So your financial advisor would work with you on that. And the most recent example I can give is in Burlingame Elementary School District. We worked with them this last time, and they actually did a rather large bond in March of 2020 that was successful. And it was their second waiver from the state to exceed that local capacity, that 1.25%, so that they could actually go further in debt. And there is an analysis that's done. It is similar to some of the work that you've done. And it says, this is a growing housing market. Our assessed valuations keep going up. There is no reason to assume that we wouldn't be able to repay back this debt. So you are able to get a waiver from the state. I don't know how close you are as a district to that limit. I suspect that you still have some room, but we could work with your financial advisor to get that information for sure.
Okay, thank you. And then the other question is what's a typical funding gap? Is a third of the total financing cost typical for a funding gap? I mean, this is like 50% of the rental income additional that we're trying to raise out of the bond. And I don't know, is that normal? Should we be looking at that as like, this is a good use of money? It's a typical gap.
That's a good question.
I can give an answer on that. In early discussions with the committee and your financial advisor, KNN, they were at the time working with a district, I believe in the Central Valley. And that district had arrived at almost exactly the same place we are, which is they had a housing project of X dollars, and about a third was a gap that couldn't be covered by COPs. And so the recommendation was to do the COP plus GO bond as the financing tool. So there is a precedent that's just, a handful of months ahead of you, and there's probably others that we could research. But I think what's important about that gap is that it's respecting the limitations that you calculate for what your rental income is going to be. And so we've been ultra conservative up to this point with vacancy factor thrown in, a very healthy operating expenditure per year, and reasonable but not excessive rental increases over time, as well as inflation. So we've got a model built, and we'll continue to work with KNN on turning those dials to make sure that you all understand what's kind of the relevant anchoring point that then lets you decide how much GO bond money you need to put in.
Yeah, and I might add, at least the school districts that I know of in San Mateo County and Santa Clara County who have gone with workforce housing recently, they have had some kind of gap and needed a bond. So I don't think we're an outlier in that. And Joy, I don't know from your experience if that's similar to what you're seeing in other communities.
Yes, many districts have been looking at this as an opportunity to help provide funding for workforce housing, and oftentimes it is that gap. So just as Peter said, it is becoming more and more common where there's an interest in workforce housing.
And I guess it's worth footnoting that what's driving that limitation on your COPs is your desire to provide truly affordable housing to your employees. So, you're going to charge less rent so that they can actually afford to live in the community. And that creates that stress on the financing over time. But in my opinion, it's a great reason to consider doing that.
Any other questions or comments? Cecilia, do you have anything?
So I don't have any questions. I appreciate again, Peter, for your presentation, and Alyssa for the information. I would say, let's go for it. Again, like we said before, we have the momentum and we've been working so hard in this project that why not just go out there and, find out what the community has to say and see what their opinion is. So that's just my thought.
So, Dawn, I have a question for you. With the facilities master plans, there were several projects that we wanted to do as well. But can we also take a look at the facilities in terms of the impact on them by global warming? We've had several parents come to the board meeting and they're concerned about the temperature in the classrooms. So could that be included?
Oh, absolutely. We can take a look at anything you would like to look at.
Maria, I'm glad you mentioned that because I had mentioned that to Don too. I was thinking particularly as we think about climate action, we should think about trying to get more solar to really do our part with, electrifying where we can with solar. So, and then like you said, with the classroom, so that's good.
Yeah, ever since I've been on the board, we've had people and we fix it in one location and then someone else pops up. So I think it's a time to really take a good look at it holistically and see where we can improve, whether it's replacing the windows with double pane or whatever it takes. So if you could include some of those questions as well for the poll, that would be great. So I guess now I would like to know if we're all in agreement of moving forward with the poll.
Yeah, I think we should move forward.
I agree. I'm moving forward. Yes.
John?
So at the next board meeting, I'll bring you the contract and we'll move forward.
Yeah, so just so it's clear, this was not a formal vote because we didn't have an action item
Right.
on this, but we're giving direction to the superintendent to move forward to put the contract together. And then at the next board meeting,
Which is
We-
next week.
right, which is next week,
Oh,
but we are
tonight.
giving direction that we need more information from our
Right.
community. So we do need to move forward with the feasibility study. Yeah, great. Thanks.
Well, thank you, Peter, and everybody for being here. And we'll keep moving forward then.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you.
I will need a motion to adjourn.
I would love to make a motion to adjourn this study session.
I'll second that.
Hey, Lisa and Janet, all in favor?
I.